5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Hey, space enthusiasts. Israel and space. Let me tell you, as an investor, I'm very excited about Israel's potential in space. You got world-class universities like Technion, you got a really strong entrepreneurial culture and ecosystem, and you have existing aerospace expertise. So it seems like you have all the ingredients to make a great space ecosystem. Just to tell you, I've been to Tel Aviv already 3 times this year, and I don't think it's going to be the last time. So I thought it made sense to bring on the Director General of the Israeli Space Agency onto the podcast. His name is Uri Oron, and we talk about all things space in Israel. Enjoy. My name is Raphael, and I'm an investor and advisor to space companies. Just as a reminder, this podcast is for informational purposes only, and nothing should be taken as investment advice. This podcast is sponsored by Nano Avionics, a satellite manufacturer and mission integrator. Their technologies enable many space companies worldwide to offer services that improve life right here on Earth, such as providing global connectivity, conducting Earth observation, or contributing to scientific discoveries. Check them out, and also check out my episode with the CEO and co-founder. Sadly, I am not a rocket scientist, but I'm an alumnus of the International Space University. ISU offers a number of educational programs about space worldwide. Check them out at isunet.edu. And just some final things before we start the episode about ourselves. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platforms such as Apple or Spotify. If you want us help expand our work, you can do so and support us at www.patreon.com/Space Business Podcast, and we'll also put that link in the episode notes. And lastly, you can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Hello, space enthusiasts. Welcome back to another episode of the Space Business Podcast. And as longtime listeners know, it's called the Space Business Podcast. But even I, being a business person, I can't talk about business all of the time. So sometimes we have people who are not space entrepreneurs or space executives, but are just really other important and interesting people from the space ecosystem. Like today, it's my great pleasure to have the Director General of the Israeli Space Agency, Uri Oron. Welcome, Uri.
Hi, great being here.
Thanks for being here. And, I've been to Israel already 3 times this year, just because, we find the Israeli space ecosystem very interesting, which I'm sure you're happy to hear. And we will talk about this. But Uri, why don't you start by giving us a little bit of background on yourself, please?
Yeah, well, I retired 4 years ago from let's say a short service in the Israeli Air Force of 32 years. I spent a little more than 32 years in the Israeli Air Force. I'm a fighter pilot. I flew almost all type of fighters in the Israeli Air Force. I command 2 squadrons. I command a base in Israel. In my last assignment, I was the head of the Israeli Air Force Intelligence Division for more than 3.5 years. After I retired, I joined a startup company dealing with AI capabilities, nothing to do with space. It was fascinating. It was related to some things that I've done in the past, but it was a whole new world. And after 2 years, a little bit more than 2 years, I was on my way to the next chapter. And then came a phone call suggesting me to take the responsibility of the Israeli Space Agency. At the beginning, it wasn't something that I planned, going to the public sector or even dealing with space. But I told to those people, okay, just give me about a week to have a chat with a few people and to read a little bit. And basically, my emotion was, whoa, this is what not I expected. That's a big story. That's a big story. And I believe that Israel sits on a window of opportunity to make space a generator and an engine for growth in economic perspective, as well as for science, educational, and the Israeli standing in the international arena. But in order to do that, we need to do a few things. But let's talk a little bit about this window of opportunity and why it is actually exists. Now, there is 2 main factors. The one is, and I'm sure that you and the listeners are familiar about it, is the huge change that happened in the last, let's say, decade in the space ecosystem internationally. US is leading that. the private entrepreneurs such as Elon Musk is leading that, but that's obvious. We're talking about space economy that should reach the amount of $1 trillion within a decade. That's obvious. Everybody knows it. The second factor of this window opportunity is the Israeli legacy. And that's maybe is not so well known. Israel was the 8th country to plan, build, launch, develop, and operate satellites by itself. It's a very small club still. Let's say 12 countries. Israel was number 8 by the end of the 80s. Israeli technology with the Bereshit project was the 4th to reach to the moon. So basically, we have the know-how of almost every part of this food chain of doing things in space. Maybe just you can put aside things such as asteroid mining or human space flight, but beside that, we have the know-how, we have the capabilities. So having this this legacy, with the Israeli attitude of doing startups and entrepreneurs almost on a daily basis everywhere, adding that to the factor of the huge change in the space economy, then what you see, that's a huge opportunity. Because if the world is heading towards a $1 trillion space market, as a nation, we should have at least 1% of it. And that's my that's my goal. And that's the main reason why I took this assignment, is to make it happen. And then, of course, we can discuss, okay, so what is the role of the government? What is your part in it? But just to tell you my background and why I'm here, that's the reason.
No, thank you, and we'll definitely talk about the role of the government and frankly other stakeholders, right? Because there's the government, the civil government, right? And in space, always very important the military side, which, like you said, you had a short career stint on that side. There's investors, and we shall talk about all of that. And it's funny, actually, you mentioned the legacy, and I fully agree. I mean, it's so impressive with Bereshit. We will talk about that, and of course, Bereshit 2 is coming up very soon as well. But I would also say, one of the reasons that in my other role, not as a podcast host, but as an investor, I'm so excited about Israel, is that you have the legacy in space, but you have the legacy also generally in deep tech and many ancillary industries, which are just important to space, like artificial intelligence and robotics, and even things like quantum computing or cybersecurity, which is going to become a huge topic in space.
I totally agree. And that's one of the things that you can, when you discuss it with other people, they are not all the time realize the depth of space. Space is something that when you dive or when you pull, you choose the direction. But when you go into it, it's basically, it's the whole world of technology, and actually the whole world of science is there. Because in order to move forward in space, you need to have physics, you need to have chemistry, you need to have mathematics. Basically, you need to have everything. And today, when you're talking about nowadays, it's also a policy and legal and of course, medicine, and everything is there. So from a nation perspective, that's a huge interest. Let's move it forward. And by that, a lot of things will follow. That's why it is so important. And in that regard, it's unique because when you look at AI or even AI and cyber, in order to promote those kinds of worlds, you need to have a very strong and solid mathematical background. But in order to move space forward, you need to have it all. Mathematics is not enough. You need to have it all. That's why it's so important.
That's why it's so exciting as well, because it's interdisciplinary. So let's take a step back. So if you kind of take, this I think this optimistic vision that we both share about Israel's, that everything is in place for Israel, become what it already is, but become an even more important nation in space. What does that mean for the strategy of the space agency, right? Because obviously, like any sort of government entity anywhere in the world, you're operating within certain constraints, including budget constraints, and you probably can't do everything you want to do, right? As anybody in the world, like even NASA can't do everything they want to do. So people, and I follow the space agencies around the world and know them well, and people pick different things. So I'm just going to mention some examples which but just for the listeners' benefit. So Luxembourg, relatively recent, focused space resources. That's the big thing. Australia, kind of less focused on science, very focused on interaction with commercial projects and the rest of the industry. Portugal, a lot of Earth observation. Brazil, many things, but a lot of focus on their own launch side. And then so roughly we have also this big divide between some of the agencies are more focused on developing commercial ecosystems, some are more focused on the science part. Where do you see the Israeli Space Agency sitting? Where would you like it to sit on this spectrum?
I will not give you the short answer. We'll come back to the short answer in a second. The long answer will be, first of all, what we need to do as a nation is to build the right infrastructure and the right ecosystem. I think we should be very cautious about the government decision where the market should go, okay? We should be very, very cautious about it because I don't think we really can control the market. But if we can to build the right infrastructure and to build the right ecosystem, and Israel, I mean, entrepreneurs everywhere, and people are having every person in Israel wake up with at least 2 or 3 new ideas every day. Most of them are not relevant, but new ideas everywhere all the time. What we need to do is to build the right infrastructure and the right ecosystem. Why infrastructure is important? Because space is still difficult. Space is hard. Even if you have a very good idea, in order to make it happen, you need to have the infrastructure. And in that regard, I think that's the role of the government, to build the right infrastructure to make those ideas flourish. Having said that, and I'm still remembering your question, I think there is at least 2 areas that Israel could be a very relevant and a strong player. One is everything that connected to big constellations of small satellites in LEO, okay? Why is that? I'm not suggesting we should compete with Starlink or with OneWeb, but Israel industry and Israel entrepreneurs could be very, very relevant in building a very significant components in that regard. The world is heading that way. Money is going to be there. We could be very relevant because Israel industry could be part of this food chain, navigation, engines, microprocessors,
sensors, probably.
Yeah, everything. So taking that area and focus on where are there problems or where can we innovate things that could be relevant to big constellations of small satellites, that could be very relevant to the Israeli industry. We know how to do things small. I think you're aware, but just very interesting fact. Israel is the only country that launched its rockets west. Everybody is launching east. We are the only one that's launching it west due to geopolitical. But that makes the industry need to deal with such a constraints and build things small without leaving the quality aside. We still keep the quality, but we do it in much small mass. So one area is those big constellations of small satellites. The other area that I think Israel could be a very, very relevant player is what we call the downstream applications.
Yes.
In downstream applications, because eventually, at least in the upcoming future, in the upcoming years, what I believe, money or the way you're going to monetize space is through those applications. It should be communication. It will be Earth observation, but it will end up with some kind of an application that will help you live your life better using space assets. In Israel, I think we can, and you can put that or add the layer of AI or even add the layer of cyber into it. So downstream applications and big constellations in low orbit, those are 2 areas that I think Israel could be a very, very relevant player. But again, going back to the role of the government, what we should do is to build the right infrastructure and the right ecosystem in order to make it happen.
No, fully agreed. And I mean, there's what's interesting in your focus areas. I mean, there's already various examples of startups I'm familiar with in Israel for both, small satellite components, right, whether it's propulsion systems or sensors. Funnily enough, I was speaking this morning to a group at the Weizmann Institute, which is actually focused on the miniaturization of sensors. So there you go.
So there you go.
And on the downstream side, I immediately think like there's examples like Tyrannus, which is like intelligence for agriculture, which is not only using space data, but that actually also makes sense if you space data with other data. So you mentioned the importance of building the infrastructure, and you probably didn't mean only physical infrastructure, right? Just to clarify, because sometimes people hear this and it's like, oh, is Uri talking about building like, launch sites and space stations and things like that? I think you mean this in a broader sense, right?
That's right. So let's take at least 3 examples of what I call infrastructure. Okay. One is really physical. What we want to build is one-stop shop for the entrepreneur to build up to 150 kilogram of satellites or relevant components in this installation. Okay, so what the government will do is to build this infrastructure that will be a one-stop shop for the entrepreneur. It will have those vacuums, chambers, and everything that related to that. He can come, he can work, he can basically build his prototype in this infrastructure. I don't want each one of those, entrepreneurs to go and build it or to go and buy those facilities in a big money. This is a physical infrastructure. But in this infrastructure, what we're going to have is not only the physical infrastructure, but also the functional infrastructure, meaning people that could help him how to reach to space, what needs to be done, even legal issues. So the government will basically will bring to the entrepreneurs the whole facility he needs in order to move forward. So this is one example. Another example that it's less physical, but I think it's crucial, is what I call access to space. If you and I will have an idea and we'll go to this one-stop shop and we'll build something, by the end of the day, we'll need to earn some space heritage. And that's, even with the reduced cost of launch and everything, that still could be some kind of an obstacle, at least to a few of those entrepreneurs. So here's another place that the government could play a role. We can bring those technologies and activities to space in order to earn space heritage. They can do it by themselves, but this is another area that the nation or the government should be involved, because it's difficult, at least to some of those startups. The third example, which I still consider as part of the infrastructure, is to bring the government to the realization of the use of space in order to promote its objectives. In other words, I'm taking the role as the space agency to take all the needs of other government entities, such as agricultures, such as HLS, agency, environmental issues, and at least we have between 25 and 30 different issues that right now are issues for the government entities that I believe that we can give answers to them using space capabilities. Now, why that is the infrastructures? Because by the end of the day, the one that will give the solution will be the industry. It's not going to be the space agency. The industry will give the solutions. So you see, when you look at it as an infrastructure, as a layer that the government is basically built in order just to promote and move forward the whole industry, it's not only physical. Some of this is much more conceptual issues.
Yeah, we totally agree. And let me actually, because I actually take a very broad view beyond the physical, like yourself on this. So let me ask about a few other potential elements, which I personally consider sort of part of a wider infrastructure to enable and foster a private commercial space ecosystem. So what about education? I think your agency is technically part of the Ministry of Science, right? And you have world-class universities like Technion, putting out very talented engineers, but not all of them may even be aware of the opportunity of space, right?
Definitely, and that's a great question. So let's talk not only about education, but also about science, because this is and if you go by age, then you start with education. But in order to have those deep tech capabilities, you need to have the education, and you need to have the connection between education and then those academies. And you mentioned the Technion, but Technion is not the only one. And you mentioned the Weizmann Institute, and it's not the only one. So let's talk about education. What do we do in the space industry? First of all, we focus ourselves basically on the high school level, and the main objective is to reach to the point that every year we're going to have between 2,000 and 4,000 high school graduate that will have a real feeling of space and a motivation to deal with space. And how we do that? We do that mainly by a project called Tevel. I don't know if you're familiar with Tevel. Tevel is the Hebrew acronym of Students Building Satellites. Last January, January 2022, we launched from Cape Canaveral 8 nanosatellites. Each one of those satellites was built by a different community, by a different high school. Okay, it was 9th and 10th grade, or it was 10th and 11th grade, like 25 kids building those 1U or 2U satellites, building it and launch it after 2 years. Okay. And they could be boys and girls, they could be Arabs or Jews, they could be religious, secular. It was 8 different groups that built the same satellite. Those it was like 200 kids. Those 200 kids finished the high school with real motivation and real experience. Space is not something to, it's not too far away. They had the experience. And we believe that at least half of those, after the military service or other services, they will join the academy or the industry. What we need to reach is to reach the number of thousands, because then you've got the real feeling of dealing with space. And we just kick off the second Tevel program a month ago with another seven different communities, and we are moving forward. So this is an example of things that we are taking responsibility as the space industry in the education system in order to promote it. And there is at least 1 or 2 other projects but they are focused in that exactly in this area. And then let's move to science. The goal in science is to promote science in the field of space, because we believe that Israel must have a very solid and very strong scientific community doing space. It goes all the way from astrophysics to engineering to everything. In Israel, there's hundreds of active scientists doing space. And actually, in Israel, in every institution, academic institution, in each one of those, you will find space in each one of those. You mentioned 2, the Technion and Weizmann, but you're going to find it in Tel Aviv and in Ben Gurion and in other places. In every one, you will find it. And what we need to do is to promote it. And one of and I guess the flagship in that regard is the Ultrasat. The Ultrasat project. We are building actually most of the fund is coming from the Israeli Space Agency. The Ultrasat project is a space telescope going to situated in a geoposition, looking from space to space. It's a UV telescope that will basically be able to locate and to monitor and take pictures of things such as supernovas, bringing down to Earth, to the Weizmann Institute, all the information, and make it as the basic data to a very, very advanced scientific researches in astrophysics. So the space agency is basically is funding most of it. It's a joint effort with other industries in Israel, and it's of course with the Weizmann Institute. So that's 2 examples of how you connect education, science, and eventually it will fuel the whole ecosystem.
Okay, great. So you have obviously the world-class universities and institutes, and they're generating this very talented, qualified people who can become entrepreneurs or employees or researchers. You also have amazing technologies being developed. So the next step then is to obviously to sort of foster the startup, the company building, right? And that kind of comes to topics like, how do you work with, people who incubators, accelerators, and there's now some in Israel. Shout out to Starburst has a presence in Israel. Another one just started, Earth and Beyond Ventures, and there might be some I'm forgetting now. And how do you foster sort of the startup building, right? There's the work with incubators, accelerators, with other investors, I guess, like myself, and there's some, sort of local versions of myself. I don't know whether you've also kind of directly support startups financially with grants, or whether that's, for example, going by the Israeli innovation authorities. But how do you support the ambitious startup entrepreneur who has decided to embark on that space startup?
So So yes, we are doing that mostly through or with the Israeli Innovation Authority. We will not go into the details of the budget, and now the budget flow, it's not really relevant, but we are using those exactly those engines in order to support directly those startups, as well as to promote those incubators. So this is one of the I guess one of the main tools that we are using, but we are doing even more than that, because I believe our probably biggest challenge is to bring awareness to those startups, to the entrepreneurs, because at least in Israel, most of the entrepreneurs will go to the areas of, let's say, cyber, AI, automotive, maybe today food tech, space, because space, it's still difficult to. Some of those space seems to be real far away. The ROI is long term. So those, when you use your, we are calling them those youngs, but not necessarily always young, but those entrepreneurs, a lot of them are reaching for relatively short ROIs. Space, it's in a different world. So what we are doing, we are doing a lot of awareness things. Actually, go and talk with people. Go and talk with those entrepreneurs. Go and speak to those youngsters and tell them the story of, hey, big things are happening in space. There is a lot of opportunities. Divert, at least, what I want to do is, let's say 10 kids or 10 young people in Israel. What I need to have is at least 2 or 3 of those to look at space as an opportunity. Today, we are not there because they are not aware to the potential of space. And again, I told you my personal story. I was not aware to the potential of space.
Yeah,
they should be aware. they should be aware of the potential of space. And in that regard, those podcasts, things that you are doing, they are very relevant. People are not aware to the potential of space, and in that regard, it's not only help them with money; it's also bring awareness to them.
Yeah, and this is of course, and again, thank you for being here today. This is precisely why I started the podcast, because I see this. It's not only in Israel. This is sort of a worldwide need. Actually, Israel to some extent may already have an advantage in sort of generating this awareness, because I think the importance of something like the Bereshit mission is probably immense in creating national awareness.
You're absolutely right. We tried to compare the Apollo effect with the Bereshit effect. I'm sure you're aware of the Apollo effect in the US in the 60s and 70s. And there is a Bereshit effect in Israel. We cannot really measure it because the numbers are not as big as in the US, but there is a Bereshit effect. The fact that this amazing project reached to the moon, yes, we experienced what we call hard landing, but hey, this is the way you learn.
Yeah,
but the whole nation was basically attached to the screens and waiting to see what's happened. And the Bereshit project was amazing. And yes, we have the Bereshit 2. We are moving forward with the Bereshit 2 project. Right now, it's scheduled to launch by the end of 25, beginning of 26. The Bereshit project, again, it's going to be a not-for-profit project made by Space.il. The Israeli government will be involved in some amount, but again, it's a private entrepreneur will run it. The spaceship will reach to the moon and will send for the first time 2 landers to 2 different spots on the moon. Each lander will carry scientific and educational missions. The data will go back to the spacecraft that will orbit the moon, the moon for, let's say, 2 or 3 years, and the data will go back to Earth to basically to build an educational and scientific programs. And we are actually going to start the educational part of it by the end of 24, beginning of 25. We'll start the educational program in Israel, doing with Bereshit 2, because what we want to do is to have those kind of projects inside schools and high school dealing with the Bereshit at least a year prior to the launch. So yes, Bereshit is an amazing project. Again, and look at the difference. It came from the totally private sector. The idea, most of the funding is coming from there, but if we'll act efficiently enough, it could harness a lot of ideas and a lot of energy towards a very, very interesting and bright future dealing with space in that regard, the lunar surface. And you mentioned Bereshit, but Israel also signed the Artemis Accord, and in Artemis 1, we do have some technology, in Israeli technology, on board the Artemis 1. It was the protecting, the Astrorad, the radiation protective suit made by Stemrad. We are just right now analyze the outcome of this scientific effort. We know it was very, very successful, and right now we are working to understand and to realize the Israeli contribution to the rest of the Artemis program. We don't know exactly what that technology is going to be, but we are working on that to identify and to decide, of course, with NASA and other partners about the next or the upcoming contribution of Israel to this amazing program.
And of course, Bereshit is not the only sort of high profile space project. I mean, I definitely also have to talk about the Axiom 1 mission and what's called the Rakia project in Israel. If only if I don't, then my friend Melody is going to be very upset with me. But it's we don't. This is of course a very prominent project. If people don't know, the Axiom 1, so this private astronaut mission that Axiom flew to the International Space Station. It had an American astronaut. It had two American astronauts, a Canadian astronaut, but it did also have, if I'm not mistaken, a fellow ex-fighter pilot, actually, Eitan Stibbe, as the second Israeli to reach space. So I'm sure that also had a similar effect to Bereshit and sort of the national awareness.
Yeah, definitely. Eitan is a very good friend, and he did a lot in order to promote space awareness to Israel by executing the Rakia or the AX-1 mission. And again, thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of people were engaged with the activities of the Rakia mission during last year. It was exactly a year ago. So yes, it was an amazing things to see. But again, look at it from a very interesting and a different perspective. What happened here in Rakia or in AX-1 is those private people joined to a private company, going to the International Space Station built by governments in order to execute dozens of activities and experiments. All of them came from different entities, from hospitals, academies, and even, art. This is the story of New Space, the connection between private, public, government. Now, when we talk about New Space, this is New Space. That's why I think AX-1 and the Rakia mission was so important. It's not government only. It's exactly the combination between private, public, governments. In order to move it forward, this is what we need. And in that regard, Eitan, AX-1, Rakia was a great example of how things should be done in the future.
And so what does that, I mean, you're actually in this very fortunate, position that even as a small country, you have these really high profile private initiatives. So tangibly, then as part of the government, as a space agency, how do you what are some examples how you tangibly work together with these private initiatives?
It's a good questions. What we are doing is, first of all, we are contact. And I always ask them, okay, what I need to do? What do you need from me? And it's a lot of times it's end up with we just want to be with you. We just need the government to be with us. It's not always the money issue. It's the understanding of the importance. And in that regard, because the private sector, all those private entities that are still seeking not the approval, but the partnership with the government entity. And that's something important that we, the government, need to understand. They are seeking this kind of partnership in order to strengthen the importance of what they are doing. Okay, and in that regard, this is exactly. Sometimes we are trying to provide some funding, But a lot of times what we are trying to provide is, for example, access to high school, access to other government entities, even access to the media. And this is something that we can do. It's not always just money and funding. Is the understanding that the need is real. The need is a national need, and in that regard, we are allowed to cooperate. What we need to do is to discuss and have this kind of understanding. Okay, what exactly do you need from us? It's not only money.
Makes sense. And let me ask about just two more elements, which are also coming back to what we call the infrastructure, right, and building the right infrastructure to foster the space ecosystem. So one is sort of having a friendly legal framework for people to operate in, right? We already mentioned the Artemis Accords, which of course are sort of international accords, right? But I should know, but I don't. But for example, is there something like a space law in Israel, or how does it work on a regulatory front?
Good question. Israel don't have space law yet. Yeah. The word is Israel don't have a space law yet. We are working on that because we realize that we need one. The Israeli culture is not usually runs to put things under a law framework. We sometimes try to solve them other ways, but we understand that we need, and we are working on a space law right now. The interesting thing about it is that I think that putting things in the right legislative framework is also an opportunity, because then you can establish the right process within the government to develop the space ecosystem. I think there is, in space law, it's not only a constraint. If and when we will build it right, we can use the space law as an opportunity to put the right framework in order to the government and government entities to help them develop the space ecosystem.
Yeah, understood. And then the other part of what I'd call the infrastructure I want to ask you about is sort of like the your interactions, relationships with other parts of the economy, including, obviously the non-space side of the economy. So like, big significant corporate players who maybe could use space, probably a lot of them, but maybe not aware of that yet. Are you trying to foster that interaction as well? Is that happening?
So yeah, we're working on that. A lot of my time is exactly towards those other players in the government entities and other entities. Again, tell them the story. Things are changing. Access to space is much easier. You can achieve, we can bring value to your issues. And again, basically what I found is most of the time, they just don't know the story. For them, we are stuck in the middle of the 80s or the 90s. The space is only government, or space is only science. It's only, those going to the moon or very difficult or very big satellites. They don't know the whole thing. So just tell them the opportunities. The one that we are really now aware, or the one that just, are very close by. And by telling those entities, what we are, and we can see it coming, we can see it happening, is those other entities, government or even big industry companies, they start to realize the potential of space. And I can see it in Israel. Big groups are taking space into consideration much more than in the past. They could be, in the banking infrastructures, big entrepreneurs that are not dealing with space. They start to talk about space. A big organization are talking about space where they didn't do that in the past. So the answer is yes. But again, I tell them, okay, we are like in the middle of the 90s when the internet was something that was just started. Nobody thought about Airbnb or WhatsApp, but it was somewhere over there in the future. I don't know what's going to be the Mobileye or the Airbnb of space in the next decade, but something will be there. I want us to be part of it.
Yeah, and enable that. That makes perfect sense. So kind of tying this all together, sort of as we're kind of coming towards the end of the podcast, I think fortunately we have quite a few listeners in Israel as well. So like, is there sort of like, one message you want to leave with them, like the person, especially the person who may have some interest in space and hence is listening to this podcast, but hasn't really, embarked on the full journey yet?
One short sentence. Space is open to business. Join the ride.
Space is open for business. Join the ride. That's fully agree. That's a good one. And we have one traditional final question always on this podcast, which is, it's a space podcast, right? So people typically like science fiction. And so if that's the case for you as well, would you share some of your favorites in science fiction? This could be books or movies or TV shows or anything.
Well, surprisingly, I'm not really a guy of science fiction. Most of my readings goes back to history, but nevertheless, as a kid, Starship was something that I didn't miss waiting for those episodes when I was a kid. But maybe because of my background, I'm focusing myself in history. But what you can find very, very relevant, that even by looking at the past, you realize the importance of those dreamers. Sometimes they call them, those crazy peoples, and the importance of science in order to make things happen. So I do understand the importance of looking into those episodes. But I guess Starship was the one that I was.
Star Trek. You mean Star Trek?
Star Trek. Yeah. Star Trek. Star Trek is something that I was very, very. I guess Star Trek was one of my favorite as a kid.
Good stuff.
As a kid.
So I'll do something that you usually don't do. I'll give you a recommendation, just because it's a fellow ex-fighter pilot, Chris Hadfield. He wrote a novel called The Apollo Murders, and it's like alternative history. It's sort of like takes place during the Apollo days, but with a hypothetical further Apollo mission that's a purely military mission. I think you may enjoy that.
Which one? Apollo? What was the name?
It's called the Apollo Murders.
Apollo Murders.
It's a thriller. It takes place on the moon and in orbit.
It's a book. It's a novel. It's a novel.
Yep.
Well, let's take some homework. I'll take my homework to read it. And you'll take the homework to have another episode with me like a year from now and to see what's changing.
For sure. With great pleasure. And I hope to be back in Israel. I went 3 times already this year. I hope to be back in June. And again, I think this is a sign of how excited we as investors are about the Israeli space ecosystem. But Uri, thank you so much for coming on today about explaining a little bit what Israeli Space Agency is doing. And I hope to give some inspiration to our listeners in Israel and frankly, everywhere. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, that's it for another nominal episode of the Space Business Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider giving it a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, such as iTunes. You can follow us on Twitter at podcast_space. Also consider supporting us at www.patreon.com/spacebusinesspodcast. If the podcast got you interested in learning more about the business opportunities in the space economy, check out my new online course on space entrepreneurship on udemy.com. The link is in the episode description. Lastly, if you have any feedback, including ideas for guests, and that may include yourself if you have an exciting space story to tell, or interested in being a sponsor, drop us an email at spacebusinesspodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to seeing you for the next episode.